Hello and welcome to Dotting the I in Spaceship, a podcast about science fiction and writing. I'm Bob and this is episode 6. This week I want to talk about consistency in stories, but before we get to that, some quick housekeeping. Last week I wrote a blog post about being positive and finding motivation. On Tuesday I released a free flash fiction story, another Frank Mason story, where Frank finds himself in the middle of a difficult situation. I did a review of the TV show Another Life, and it is what spurred the main topic for today. And my Patreon exclusive flash fiction was a story about a young woman named Zethula arriving at the academy where not everything is as it seems. Next week there will be a blog, a free story, a review, a Patreon exclusive, and a podcast, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. Keen observers will notice that this podcast is actually a week late, and that's because I had to work 6 days this week. So I didn't have time for anything else other than work and sleep. So I'm back to the normal 5-week schedule. I'm not covering anyone anymore. So I need to push ahead. I want to get, 3 weeks worth of work done in the next 2 weeks. Try and get ahead of things so that when something inevitably happens like this that pushes me back, I can actually have the flexibility built into my schedule to be able to deal with it. This is, of course, something that I have been talking about on the podcast and the blog for a while, in that it's something that I know that I need to do, but it isn't as easy as just saying that you need to do it and then finding the time. I need to put getting things done on schedule at the highest priority, something which is not just good for building a regular listener readership, but also it's really good for the Google algorithm to in order to respond. Anyway, it's one of those things that I know that I need to do, but it isn't as easy as just saying that I need to do it and then it will happen. This was another week where it was really apparent that sleep and health need to be high priorities as well as getting work done. So I felt too shitty to get stuff done, which is funny considering that the podcast topic last week was overcoming resistance and how you shouldn't give in to those things that make you feel so crappy and make you think that you can't get good work done. And it's not that I didn't think that I could get good work done, it's that I wanted to get some sleep and so that I didn't get too grumpy and quit my job, because I need money to live. Either way, we're back on schedule for this week, so I want to make sure that I get the work done for this week most importantly, and if I can get some extra work done and get ahead, then that would be great. I've only got, one more week of footy left, and then I'm going to have 2 days in the weekend and be able to be more flexible if I've got 2 days of the weekend rather than one, when in that one I'm trying to move my sleep pattern from a night shift worker to a day pattern. I'm going to be awake and feeling a bit less shitty, so I'm looking forward to that, but that is not going to come until the first week of September. This work that I'm getting done now all needs to be done in the schedule of I need to make sure that I get it done during footy season, and part of that is to prove to myself that I can get it done when I only have, time after work and 1 day a week to catch up, because that's half the year for me. Half the year is spent helping out, volunteering at footy, and I'm not going to give that up because it's one of the few social things that I do outside of work, which is not a social thing. Anyway, moving on. I would like to thank those who have supported me on Patreon. Currently, my wall of awesome only has 3 names on it, and if you can get your awesomeness level up, you can reach the top of it, a place which is currently dominated by Zevin Art. If you get some entertainment from my work, then think about giving me a hand to make more of it by contributing on Patreon. If you want to contribute but you don't have any cash to spare, that's cool too. I was a poor uni student for a long time, and I'm just glad that I could help make your day a little better. You can still help by singing my praises to everyone you meet, put a comment or a rating on the podcast, stop random people in the street and tell them to check out my work, hijack the local radio station and play a loop of my podcasts, even build a giant space laser and use it to burn my website address into the face of the moon. What I'm saying is, I really appreciate any level of support. The topic this week is consistency in fiction. This happens both in science fiction and in fantasy, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to be focusing mostly on science fiction because that's probably where it annoys me most, really. When it happens in fantasy, well, I don't care as much because I don't read as much fantasy. But this is definitely a problem that occurs in both, and when it does happen, I find that it breaks my immersion with the story, and sometimes to the breaking point where I'll just put a book down or stop watching a show and never come back to it. So, what I'm not talking about when I'm talking about consistency in fiction is things like the difference between hard and soft science fiction. So, I don't care that a TV series has an FTL drive and that it breaks all the laws of physics. What I do care about is that in every shot, when they, drop things fall, and then maybe the gravity goes out or something, and instead of them now being in 0G and floating around, and there being a conservation of momentum, which has happened in every other shot because it was filmed in the real world, they float, or they can spin in mid-air, or when they use a fire extinguisher, for instance, it seems to have an incredible amount of force, far more force than any fire extinguisher that exists in real life, specifically for drama purposes. Of course, I'm referring to some of the scenes from Another Life, which I reviewed in the last week, and man, that show really broke me. What I'm saying is I don't have a problem with there being something in the story which breaks the laws of physics. I have a problem with the consistency of that thing. So if the FTL drive exists and it moves the ship, in one instance it moves the ship from one planet to another in a day, and then in the next episode it takes 4 years for them to do the same journey, but the FTL drive isn't broken, there's no reason for it. It hurts your brain. It makes you think, well, why isn't this working the way that it's supposed to be working? So it doesn't just have to be for introduced things like an FTL drive. In fact, if anything, it annoys me even more when it's not for something like that. I feel like I've got, in my suspension of disbelief, I've got an extra measure for when they've introduced something, which is like, I keep using FTL as an example, but even in a fantasy story, they've introduced magic. Magic works in a certain way, and if you can nitpick your way to finding some case where it hasn't worked like it is supposed to, or is expressed to explode, I'm able to give the author or the writer a measure of rope, I suppose, when it comes to something that they've made up. But when it comes to things that they haven't made up, like how conservation of momentum works, how photosynthesis works, how bombs work, I only have so much rope I can give them. There's a point where, and this is why I wrote the review of Another Life, is that there were so many times where it was clear to me that things were happening where they just hadn't bothered to consult anyone with any science background. Whoever was writing that show didn't seem to pay any attention to how the real life works, and clearly they didn't run it through a filter. They didn't get some science lackey and say, hey, can you check over this script that and I feel like if you're going to write a science fiction show, how hard would it be to employ one person to read through the script and vet it from the purpose, from the point of view of a science fiction? I mean, arguably the person that loves writing science fiction and is writing science fiction probably should already know these things, so maybe that's why they didn't. But I mean, it just smacks with terrible writing. I mean, so I don't want to rag on Another Life all podcast long. There was another show that came out a couple of years ago called Salvation. The concept of salvation was a huge asteroid is coming to destroy the Earth, and they've got to find out how to beat it, and there's all these B-plots going on. The story, I watched the first episode and I was amazed that they could write such a poor story, because at the same time, I was doing research for a novel that I want to write, which is about an asteroid it's partly about an asteroid hitting the Earth, and in doing the research for how to make it realistic and how it would work, how an asteroid hitting the Earth would actually work. How big does it need to be? What's the actual effect? What do we know from past instances when that's happened? In reading up, and that's not like I was, delving into the deepest textbooks to find this information. It's just a Google search. Like, in reading up on that, you learn things like how NASA has already developed protocols for what would happen if we were threatened by a giant asteroid from space. So you need to know what is already in the real world for how things work when you're writing them in science fiction. I mentioned in my review that there's a scene where there's a scene in Another Life where Katie Sackhoff is doing an EVA by herself, which we've never ever had a policy that you can do an EVA by yourself, because the possibility that you could become incapacitated and require aid is not something that can be solved by having, an hour-long process to get them to suit up to come out and help you. Right? We always do EVAs as two people, and that is a policy we've always had and will always have, because having a layer of cloth between you and hard vacuum, the threat is not going to ever go away. No matter how well we make the cloth, we're always going to recognize the danger in going out in a personalized spaceship which is made out of cloth and flexible enough to allow us to move in order to make repairs on the outside of a spaceship. It's not the kind of thing that it would be acceptable for the captain of the ship, of all people, to head outside and do work on. So, I'm trying to get away from Another Life, but getting back to the show Salvation, they discover this asteroid which is coming for the Earth, and they've got to make some plan to stop it from hitting the Earth. And all of the things that go on in that show, it's all just fake drama. They discover an asteroid which is far too close to the Earth than is reasonable for an asteroid to be discovered. They use mechanisms to try and deflect the asteroid which are not reasonable in the time frame at hand. Like, they've got a couple of months before this asteroid is going to hit, and they plan to use a gravity tractor, which you wouldn't use unless there was 10 years of lead time. So just all of their plans don't make sense, all of their actions don't make sense, and then they throw in with that drama of terrible not making sense. When you've got characters that are supposed to be smart, you throw in with that a bunch of extra drama and B-plots and, I don't know, CIA and something. I don't know. I watched the first season with some kind of grim, I don't know, it's like watching something really bad for pleasure. You watch it with this kind of grim fascination of, like, how can they make something so bad? I don't mean to be specifically ragging on individual shows. I mean, what I'm trying to talk about today is the fact that it doesn't take that much effort to do basic research on a topic that you want to write a story about in order to make it seem decent and to follow the rules that actually exist in the universe. Because when you're not following the rules that exist in the universe, you better be not following them for a reason. You better be, there's some magic, there's some technology, and that's why you can circumvent these laws. If you can just circumvent the conservation of momentum, then I don't care about your story, because you haven't done enough basic research to be able to make it seem real. So, in speaking about this, it reminds me of when I went through and read, what's it called? Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. So I like survival stories, I like watching survival shows, and I found that it's a persistent theme that I come back to in a lot of stories. There's always some element of survival against the elements, and I don't know, I just really like that story, telling that story for some reason. And so I thought, I'd read The Martian, and it has elements of that survival against nature labyrinth plot. And I thought, well, I'll go back and I'll read the classic, and I'll learn something from it, hopefully. So I went back and I read Robinson Crusoe, and I have to say, I know it was written in, like, the 1600s. I don't remember the exact year. I think it was towards the the late 1600s, early 1700s when it was written. So literary standards were different. I could get over... It's like when I read Pride and Prejudice, right? That story's nearly 200 years old. You can get over the language barrier. Even though it's still in English, it's written differently. Punctuation was different. The way that sentences were designed was different as you go further back into the past. The difference between Robinson Crusoe and Pride and Prejudice is a story that will be retold for centuries because it is fantastic. It's complete. The way that time moves in the story is really well plotted, right? The way that Elizabeth Bennet moves through that story, it takes about a year. There are little bits and pieces that are added into the story that tell you whether it's spring or winter, and everything flows, and when they travel from one location to another, it takes the appropriate amount of time, and it is part of crafting. And I mean, Pride and Prejudice is a love story. You don't even need to add in all of those fantastic pieces to make it such a complete and well-written story, but I think that's part of the reason why it will always be recognized as a classic, is that it does have all of those things. It is consistent. The way that time moves in the story is exactly as time should move. In comparison, Robinson Crusoe is an absolute abomination. So Robinson Crusoe is left shipwrecked on this tiny island, and he needs to learn how to survive on this island. Now, instead of learning how to survive on this island, he goes for a swim out to the ship, which, whilst he was the only one that survived, the ship is almost complete and marooned on the rocks. So that it's not even broken apart in the way that I read it, at least. It's not damaged that much, but for some reason Robinson Crusoe is the only survivor. Okay, that's strange. Then he goes onto the ship and he finds like sacks of grain, and he's able to get metal workings and things and recover them from the ship, and he recovers all of this material from the ship that he's then able to use to build rudimentary tools, so he doesn't have to struggle really at all. And I mean, just the finding of the grain really got under my skin. I was like, why isn't it wet? The whole ship was supposed to be destroyed enough to kill all these sailors, and here's this guy who's a novice sailor at best, but he's the one who survives through sheer luck and the fact that the story asked for him to, I guess. And he goes and gets this wheat, and he uses that to plant a wheat field on his island, and he magically finds some goats. And I think at one point he takes a slave from somewhere, and at one point he's worried about scurvy, and he goes for a walk and finds a lime tree. And the lime tree was the part of the story that broke me, where everything else I was like, wow, this is a really fantastic story, and maybe part of the reason that I'm struggling is the language barrier, and maybe I'm just, not getting into it, I'll just try and get through it. But when he got to the lime tree, which is well inland, not a native of the area where he's been shipwrecked, there's no reason for the lime tree to exist and be there. Like, there are other sources of vitamin C, and, Daniel Defoe didn't have access to the internet. He wouldn't have been able to look up what the kind of plants were in South America that he could use in order to get vitamin C for the guy. And at least he thought, maybe I need to have him so he doesn't get scurvy, considering the sources of food that I'm giving him. But it's just so poorly done that I couldn't keep my suspension of disbelief. It was broken in that moment, and it will forever, the lime tree is forever in my brain as the just terrible storytelling. So when you look at, from the perspective of someone who likes that kind of story, the difference between that and watching like Castaway with Tom Hanks, right? So Castaway it's a pretty good movie. I rewatched it recently. I think I was going to do a review on it, but I don't think I wrote anything. Castaway has this. It follows the same kind of story, almost to the T, of Robinson Crusoe, except there's a shipwreck. There's a number of things that can help him. He doesn't find huge sacks of grain and goats and slaves. He finds a reasonable amount of debris that he's able to use to his advantage. And then when I don't remember what the time jump is after he makes fire. There's a time jump of a couple of years maybe. And in that time jump he has become competent and used his materials to the best of his ability, but he hasn't built a manor in the way that Robinson Crusoe does. At least for me personally, consistency in story helps to build the world where the story lives. If you want to write a good story that I'm going to enjoy, then you want to write a story where if something breaks a rule, you're told why and how. Or at least, so this week I've been going back and I've been rereading The Furies of Calderon by Jim Butcher, which is a great series, 6 books. It's really awesome, and I haven't found anything that Jim Butcher's written that I haven't liked. Furies of Calderon is a fantasy story. It's not really magic, but there's magic, and there's a scheme for how it works. You're never expressly told in the story exactly how things work, but you are given a framework of what is and isn't possible, and Jim Butcher doesn't break those rules. He sets parameters for how powerful people are, why they are so powerful, and even if he doesn't expressly tell you, and maybe you need to pick the pieces out of all 6 books to really understand how he's crafted the world and what the rules are, because even the characters sometimes don't know the rules. It's very clear that Jim Butcher knows the rules. He doesn't break them. 6 books where he doesn't break the rules. He sets them from the very first story. He puts in his setups and he pays them off, and it's a well-constructed piece of series that, I go back and I read that series like maybe once a year. And the reason that I keep coming back to it is because it is so well crafted and so well constructed. It is a masterwork in my mind of how to write a 6-book long series where all the payoffs have their directly connected setups across multiple books, which would be really hard to... there are setups in book 1 that are paid off in book 3, and there are setups, it's relatively easy in the editing process and the drafting process to have your setups pay off in one book, but to have it over multiple series, and especially to have it in something that isn't grounded in the real world. So it's not like you can just Google how conservation of momentum works. This guy's talking about the magical ability to earthcraft and all this stuff. The reason that I bring it up is that it's a perfect example of how to create a world where it doesn't follow the rules of the real world, and yet it does follow its own internal consistencies. When you read The Furies of Calderon, there is nothing that breaks the rules. He just sets his own rules. And that's what I want from a story. When I watch a story that tells me that it's a science fiction story and it's based in the future, and they're trying to be all hard sci-fi about it, and yet then you have bad procedures and you have scenes that are clearly done for the drama of it rather than being done in a way that's believable if you've got any knowledge in how any of the systems on a spacecraft would work. And I guess what I'm trying to really bring home is that it's okay to have magic in your story. It's okay to have an advanced civilization that has this incredible technology. It's okay to have the Force, or pick a thing that's not in the real world. It's okay to write a story where things that happen in the story don't happen in the real world. But if you're gonna write that story, you have to be consistent. If you're not consistent, you're gonna lose a lot of readers to just putting the book down because it doesn't make sense. And even if you're not concerned about losing a bunch of readers, you're going to be writing a story that isn't good. You're going to be writing a story that is not as good as it could be by changing a few simple things. I'm not talking about changing what happens in a scene. I'm just talking about changing it so that it makes sense. It's okay to have a scene where the gravity goes off and someone is not in control because, now there's no gravity and humans are designed to be in gravity. So they go to walk and they push off and now they don't have anything to push against and they're floating through the air and they're helpless. That's fine. Do that. But don't have a person that's standing still push off from the ground. Because there's been no force to push them off from the ground. When the gravity went off, their legs didn't move. Have them try to make a step, and in making a step, they push off from the ground. It isn't that hard. It just takes a little bit of research. And I think ultimately what I'm trying to say with all of this is that when I read or I watch things and they haven't done the basics of research into how the thing that they're writing works, what it tells me is that they didn't care enough to do a basic Google search. I don't forgive Robinson Crusoe and Daniel Defoe for writing a terrible story where everything falls into his lap. But maybe that was something that happened in the time. Like I've got more of I can give him more of a pass in that it was written 300 years ago, and things that were written in the past had different standards of what they needed to be in order to be good. Maybe at the time when it was written, there's a reason why it's considered to be a classic. Maybe at the time that it was written, it was considered that was okay to have that sort of Deus Ex Machina come into stories, which, I can immediately say, no, it wasn't, because there are other things written in a similar period where that's not true, but in ancient Greece, it was fine to have a story end with Deus Ex Machina. There was a catharsis to having the gods come down and solve all of your problems. And it's definitely something that we've moved further and further away from. Personally, when I watch a story where all of the problems are solved by magic, not by actual magic, but all the problems are solved by Deus Ex Machina, I don't think that that's a very good story. I don't think that it's well constructed, and it breaks me out of the story framework. It makes me realize that I'm sitting in a cinema. It makes me realize that I'm sitting in front of a screen. It detracts the characters from me when I see them behave in a way that they shouldn't. If a person is a captain on a spaceship, they should behave as a captain. If they're a second in command, they should know basic things like how fire safety works. If they're an engineer, they probably shouldn't burn their fingers on the bits and pieces of the spaceship unless they... so Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, for instance, right, in that show, which, I watched that show with the same kind of grim fascination. It's not a good show. There are components of it that I really like. It comes back to, it's a show where they're marooned, sort of, the captain is marooned in time, and he's got to try and build a life in this new time frame, right? So it has that element of survival. There's really crappy writing, and it's sometimes really corny, and that breaks me out of it a lot of times. But the characters in that show behave in the ways that they behave for a reason. There's a reason that Harper, who's the engineer, the reason that I thought of him was what I was saying about burning your fingers on a conduit, right? Harper has this ability to sort of, the way that he builds things maybe is not from spec, right? And the reason that is because he didn't have any formal training. He learnt how to build things in an occupied planet or whatever. And you don't know that in episode 1. You sort of feel that this world is dirty and gritty, and people that have gained a level of ability are probably not trying to essentially steal a spaceship, which is where you find the characters in the first episode. So you already know that they're maybe not 100% on the level because there's a level of nefariousness. But I'm like, at least in that show, even in that show with all the corny things and the the bad references to Hercules and everything else that goes on in that show, even in that show, there was a reason why people acted the way that they did. The captain was noble and held to his principles because that's the person that he was trained into this near utopian world, which is now only exists in his memory. There are people that are out to get money because they need money to live, and the only way that they've got to where they've got to is by conniving and being underhanded. And there are, people that have only gained a measure of skill by clawing it out of, the dark place that they live in. And I think that's part of the reason why I can't go back and watch a show like Andromeda, is because even when the story doesn't live up to my expectations, even when it isn't internally consistent, the characters are consistent in what they're trying to do. I felt, when I was watching Another Life this week, I felt that same kind of, I don't know what to call it, there's kind of a fascination with something that's broken. When you're watching something that, it's almost like a morbid curiosity. I knew watching it, even from the first episode, I was like, there are so many things that, there's a kernel in the first episode that asks a question that I'm interested in them answering, but there are a lot of red flags that come up in the first episode that make me think they're probably never going to be able to tell me the answer to the question that they're asking. Because if you can't get basic things right, if you don't have a good foundation for your story to happen, you're probably not going to get all the way to having a good answer. Ultimately, I think in all of this, what I'm really trying to say is there is no reason in this day and age not to do a Google search. I'll give Daniel Defoe a pass. It would have been really hard to search through encyclopedias to try and find what plants gave vitamin C in the Atlantic Ocean in islands off of the coast of South America. But in the kind of stories that we expect to do well, to enter into the public consciousness, to be considered to be masterworks written today, you should be able to at least do a basic Google search to understand the fundamentals of how things work. If you're writing a scene that happens in 0G, there is no reason why you can't spend 45 minutes on Google searching how do things work in 0G. What the hell is the conservation of momentum? What force would a fire extinguisher have when you're using it? You don't even need to go that hard. You just need to realize that when you use a fire extinguisher, it doesn't throw you around the room. So what I'm saying is I really, really didn't like this show. It got under my skin. I find it, I don't know if it's just natural incredulousness. When I come across a show like that that's written in this age of information where all of that information is at our fingertips, where the ability, you don't even need the information. You just need to say, just Google scientist and send them an email, and I promise you, I'd say the vast majority of scientists would make time out of their day if you sent them an email saying, hey, I'm writing a story where, there's a scene in 0G. Can you take 5 minutes out of your day to read this scene and tell me what's wrong with it so that I can make it seem more realistic? So that I can grab a hold of the audience and bring them with me so I can tell this fantastic story. You don't need a physicist to tell you how your character should work, but you could, if you sent them a message and say, can you read this one scene and tell me if this is how things will work in 0G, and get their opinion on it. I don't know, if you sent off 5 emails to 5 physicists, I think you would probably get 5 answers back saying, yes, I can take 5 minutes out of my day to help you make good sci-fi. Alright, I think that's enough ranting about this topic for today. I'm sure it will not be the last time I rail against people's inability to Google. Anyhow, next week on Tuesday, the prompt for my Tuesday story will be Wormhole Lottery. I've got a couple of ideas on where I want to go with it, and hopefully it will be good. I was thinking that the review that I do for next week might be for the show Firefly, or I might just pick one episode, because there are a couple of really good episodes that I feel I could dig into in my usual review length, because it's such a short review. I don't know, I might rewatch some episodes this week and see how I feel, whether I write a review about the whole thing, or if I just focus on just one of the stories that I like in it. And there are a couple of really good ones that grabbed me when I watched the show back in the day. So my Thursday story will be written from the prompt of Mundane Gods, and I've got a couple of ideas for that. I spent a bit of time this week collating sort of all of my prompts and putting them into a schedule for the future so that I could be a bit more organised. But remember, if you've got any prompts or story suggestions for a challenge that you might want me to write, I can't guarantee anything, but feel free to write me a message and send me a challenge if you think there's something that you want to see how I could handle it. So, if you've got a prompt or a comment or a question, or you just want to tell me how horrible a person I am and how my entire thesis on stories being written in a consistent manner is completely wrong and I'm clearly an idiot, you can contact me at contact@robert-lynch.com or on Twitter at boblynchbsc. If you like what I do and want to help me make more of it, you can check out the Patreon and see what's on offer there. So as always, check out my website for new stuff every weekday, and I will see you next week.